Hi, and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital. Always a pleasure to have your company. We broadcast locally on Radio Northern Beaches and then through a community radio network around Australia. We also are on Spotify and YouTube and a whole range of other multimedia channels. And I'm really pleased to welcome to our feed this week Ian McLead, who is from RP Emery Legal Kits, or RP Emery and Associates. And we are here to talk about financial agreements. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Ray.
Now, Ian, we're going to talk about a number of different types of financial agreements that revolve around relationships. Now, I have a lot of people come on the show, in particular a lady called Philippa Hunt, who talks a lot about divorced women because they end up in a financial heap. And women end up at the sorry end of many separations. I guess there'd be many men out there saying, well, hang on, don't forget us as well. And I guess one of the reasons why we've asked you to come along is that our good friends at the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia suggested that we have a chat to you because you're the kind of guy that people want to be talking to early rather than late, I guess, to be able to, hopefully circumvent some of the issues that we end up going. But look, we're going to be doing, ladies and gents, this over 2 shows because what we're going to talk about today with Ian is the kind of financial agreements that partners and couples get into as they're splitting. But then we're also going to have the next show on what we can do to hopefully have the conversation before any of this starts. And the term that we often see might be a prenuptial. And again, Ian, I'm not sure if you are into the Coen brothers movies or not, but Intolerable Cruelty. Okay, so Intolerable Cruelty with George Clooney and Catherine Zeta-Jones is an excellent example of, the Miles Massey prenuptial agreement that can't be broken, but we'll get into that a bit later on. So look, welcome to the show. So look, the first thing I wanted to cover off is if you are dealing with a couple, be it hetero, be it gay, whatever, and they've come to you and said, we're splitting up. Hasn't the horse bolted? What kind of financial agreements can you bring to them that's going to help them out?
Okay, so you can make a binding financial agreement either before, during, or after a relationship is ended. So at any phase of that relationship, so long as you agree.
That's the big one. So long as you agree. That's a big caveat, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can't have a contract of any type without a meeting of the minds. So the parties have to agree to those terms. Otherwise, you don't have genuine agreement. It's part of contract law, and a binding financial agreement is simply a contract that's made under the provisions of the Family Law Act, and it's made between 2 spouse parties.
Having a look at your website, and again, ladies and gents, if you are interested, the website that I'm looking at is financialagreements.com.au, just as it's spelled, .com.au. And so the first part we're going to deal with in the next show, de facto and marriage. So we're talking today about separation and divorce. So when people come to you, what's are they actually the people that are having the bun fight, or are they conciliators? Are they arbitrators, or are they people that are well experienced in this, or are they? Is it mainly couples that are coming to you and saying, "Hey, we need a helping hand"?
It's generally couples who have already made the decisions themselves. They already know how they want to divide their property, and they're already comfortable dividing that property. Now, if somebody comes to us and they're still fighting, they don't know what they want to do, a binding financial agreement may be premature. They may still use a binding financial agreement, but you have to get that meeting of the minds first. You have to have 2 people who understand what they want to do. There can be no coercion, no unconscionable conduct. Unconscionable conduct is where one party deliberately tries to take advantage of the ignorance of the other. So if you've got coercion or unconscionable conduct or fraud or any of these issues that primarily relate to dishonesty, then you don't have genuine agreement.
But again, contract law would determine that if any of the parties are signing under duress or not fully informed, that contract is not necessarily legal and binding. If I remember my contract law from my uni days.
You do remember it correctly from your uni days. The problem is that, the parties each must receive legal advice before they sign that document. So
Okay.
let's say you've got a couple. They've been married for 25 years. They've raised a couple of kids. They've got the family home and an investment property, and they've decided that one party's going to take this property and the other party's going to take that one. Now that might seem fair and reasonable, but depending on the circumstances, there may be other factors involved that mean that that particular arrangement isn't fair and reasonable. And for that reason, the Family Law Act states that before you sign a binding financial agreement, you must get legal advice. So the legal advisor has to advise the parties of, number one, their rights and whether or not signing that agreement is to your advantage or to your disadvantage. In other words, is it a good deal for you? Have you struck a fair and reasonable bargain? So once the lawyers have provided the advice about whether it's fair and reasonable, they also have to advise you of your rights. Now, at the before divorce, for a married couple, you always have the right to ask the courts to determine how your property should be divided.
Right.
When you enter into a binding financial agreement, then you give up that right. Essentially, you give up the right to have the courts intervene and make a ruling about how your property should be divided because you've decided to do it yourself.
So, Ian, I guess if I paraphrase what you've just said back to you, you're talking about a process where I guess the couple have sat down and I guess nutted something out with a piece of paper, and I guess it begs the question. I'm thinking of process and A, B, and C, or is it A, C, B, D, or whatever? But is this a process where, for example, and financial planners could potentially get involved in this as well, where they're dealing with two parties that have mutual property interests? Do you have a checklist that you sort of tick off and start looking at, making sure that every asset, super is often, for example, super is often forgotten about or not really properly taken care of, because again, when my experience tells me that many men have a far more favorable superannuation balance because they've been working the entire time, they haven't had kids, and so when that comes up for discussion as well, that tends to throw Caro onto the fire rather than the asbestos blanket, if I can use the fire analogy. Is that something that you've seen as well, Ian, in your experience?
Yeah, of course. When you're dividing property, you're dividing all of the property. All right. So you have what we call a property pool. So the property pool is going to include the family home, any investment properties. There might be business interests. There might be, you might have a company and a family trust and a self-managed super fund. All of that property, if you control it, then it forms part of the property pool, as does superannuation, whether that be superannuation through an industry fund or a self-managed fund, whatever the case may be. It
Okay.
all falls into that property pool. And so when the lawyers provide their advice, they have to be appraised of that property pool, and then based upon the conversation they'll have, they will determine what would be a fair and reasonable division of that property pool if the matter were to come before the court. All right. So if you presented whatever it is you're presenting in this agreement, hope this makes sense. Whatever you're presenting in the agreement, if that came before the court, would the courts think it was fair and reasonable? And so the lawyers essentially put themselves in the position of the magistrate and make a determination about, is this within the scope of what might be considered fair and equitable in the eyes of the court. Now, if the arrangement is outside of what might be seen as fair and equitable, then you might you might have a situation where the lawyers have to point out to one party that, hey, you're disadvantaged by this agreement. You might get a better result if you went through the court, or you have the option to go back to the drawing board and renegotiate the arrangement with the other party. And hopefully people are, they still retain respect for each other. Most of the people that we see, they can still communicate. They still, even though their relationship might have broken down and they can't live with each other anymore, they still retain enough respect that they can come to the negotiating table and negotiate a fair outcome for each other.
I'm curious then, when we're talking about goods and chattels, and maybe we can flow this into the next half of the show, custody and children, does that ever come up into a financial agreement?
No, you cannot deal with children in a financial agreement. Children, whether it be support of children through child support, or custody, how the time you spend with those children, those issues cannot be dealt with in a binding financial agreement. Unfortunately, if there is a dispute about, who should have the kids on Father's Day or at Christmas or New Year's, whatever the case may be, if there's a dispute over that and you can't sort it out yourselves, the only way that can be resolved is through the court system.
Fair enough. Well, look, it's just about time for a break. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm here with Ian McLead. We're talking about binding financial agreements between people that aren't getting on. So, look, we're going to go for a short break. We'll be back with you in just a moment. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. Hi, and welcome back to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson. At the microphone this week, we welcome Ian McLead, who is from RP Emery, who do legal kits and provide financial binding agreements for people that are breaking up. But next show, we're also going to be talking about people that are just about to get together. So it's not always bad and gloomy and doomy. We like to talk about good stuff as well. But I guess one of the things, Ian, that you would see over the many years of experience that you've had in this field is that money and couples sometimes is not a good mix. And so one of the things that's often asked of me, and I know many of the financial planners that I have on our show, is what's the difference between a married couple seeking to split and a de facto couple? What's the big thing around de facto that trips up a lot of players when they first sort of knock on your door?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the things is, people still see de facto relationships as, well, it's not married, so there must be different rules. Well, essentially, if you've been in a de facto relationship for a long enough period, then you have the same rights as a married couple. So under the Family Law Act, a de facto couple is essentially a couple who are living together as man and wife. It can be a little bit grey, right? Because you can still have a de facto partner, and you might live in different cities. You might you might have I've often had older people where she keeps her home, he keeps his home, but they spend 3 days at her place and 4 days at his place, or vice versa. So they're always together, but not necessarily living in the one home. So it's more a commitment.
Yeah.
It's more a commitment to a shared life.
And can I clarify as well, Ian, that applies to same-sex de facto as well?
You most certainly can. Yeah, yeah. So same-sex couples are treated exactly the same as any other couple, as a
Okay, so
de facto or marriage.
okay, so what I'd like to do is if you can explain to the viewers and listeners, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, we need some assistance to get an agreement together," what kind of
Mhm.
process do you take them through? What happens? What's next?
I generally explain what their rights are um, under the Family Law Act. So essentially, you you have to be in that de facto relationship for a minimum period of 2 years. All right. So once you've reached that 2 year period, either party gains the right. You both gain the right to be able to ask the court to make orders for the division of property. So if there's a breakdown in the relationship and you can't figure out how to divide stuff yourself, you
Mhm.
have the option of going to the court, and a magistrate will make those decisions for you.
So once you're at that 2-year mark, you're as good as hitched.
Pretty much the same rules apply as what would apply to a married couple. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you've been in the relationship for 2 years, that one party automatically gets half of the other party's stuff. It doesn't work like that, and it's a popular urban myth. People say,
Ah,
"Oh, look, once you've been in there for 6 months, she's entitled to half your property or whatever," and vice versa. You often have women telling each other the same thing. I don't want to appear sexist in any way. They both both sexes have the same ability to natter between themselves. But
I
it's an
guess, I
urban
guess.
myth. It's an urban myth that um, uh, that property is divided equally
All right.
just because you've been living together for a period
So
of time.
they've come and seen you, you've explained to them their rights. What happens after that?
Well, like in our case, like we are a legal publishing service. We're not a law firm, and we probably should have pointed out earlier on, I'm not a lawyer. So I don't provide legal advice as such. I have a relationship with a group of lawyers who do provide legal advice, but essentially I coordinate a process. So I explain how binding financial agreements can be used to either divide property you're in the relationship, or they're like in the event of separation or after separation and divorce. I then the customer would then purchase a kit. So you can buy a kit through our website. The customer completes that kit and then they send the document back to me. My job is to prepare that document for the lawyers that we work with, so I make their job easier. So the lawyers, essentially all they have to do is provide legal advice in relation to the document that the parties themselves have put together.
If I was to paraphrase that back, you, in essence, are a legal practitioner, but not a lawyer per se. And again, your expertise and time in the industry, I guess, gives you that certain level of subject matter expertise. And given that, look, I hold a financial services license and a responsible manager, there's clear delineation. And I guess I'm pretty certain that the listeners and the viewers will understand clearly you aren't the lawyer and you aren't giving them legal advice per se. You're giving them information, and then the lawyers that you advise them to work with. And I guess if they've got their own lawyer, that's their choice as well, one would assume. But
that's true.
It's still down to the lawyer that is authorised and is a member of the state bar that they work, of the state that they're in, that would then give the proffered legal advice. That's correct?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it is the lawyer who provides that legal advice who is responsible to the client and to ensure that they have all of the information they need to make an informed decision about entering into that agreement.
So now that we're talking about a process, so they've come and seen you, they've filled out the documents, they've now spoken to their lawyers or respective lawyers. One assume, well, they can't have the same lawyer, that's for sure.
No, they can't.
I remember that one. No, they cannot have the same lawyer. So they've done that. Roughly how long does this take?
Look, I don't have any control over how long it takes the client or the customer to get their document back to me, but I'll give you some idea. The best, the fastest that we've seen one returned is 2 hours.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Very motivated couple. All right.
Wow.
2 hours. I was just amazed that they got it done that quickly. But 2 hours or 2 years, it really depends on the parties themselves, how long it takes to get that document back to me. But having said that, from the time we receive the document till the time the lawyers sign off is around about 3 weeks, thereabouts.
Okay. Well, that's certainly not onerous. And I have a very dear friend who's unfortunately in the courts with a fairly messy divorce. My friends and I have watched in dismay when it's not going easily, it's not going well, and they're not agreeing, and the courts are having to sit there and play arbiter. It can't be an overly satisfying thing to be an observer of, I guess, Ian. Would that be fair to say?
Look, it's just cruel. I look, I have a personal belief that the couples should do everything they can to avoid conflict. All right, because if you're, I know it's hard, and I know it's probably idealistic for a lot of people, but the standard procedure, if you're talking about a separation, the standard procedure is, okay, we're separating. What do we do now? Run off and see the lawyers. So both parties run off and see a lawyer, and the lawyer's job is to act in their client's best interest and to do the best they can for their client. And there's only a certain amount in the property pool. And it's awfully easy just to hide behind your lawyer and send curt emails to the other party and them respond in the same way. It's really easy to do that, but it's horrendously expensive. Every time another email goes out, it's another $300.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Whereas my position is, I advocate that people just do your best to, rather than go and see a lawyer to sort out the mess, go and get some relationship counseling. Go and see a mediator. Go and see somebody who is skilled in bringing people together as, so they can get a meeting of the minds.
I was going to ask, I guess, Ian, you haven't fulfilled the role of Pastor Ian by any chance when they sit there and go, so what do you reckon?
Look, I reckon that people make the first mistake they make is to run off and hire a sellsword. Leave the lawyers out of the equation until you absolutely need them. If you've got a partner who just will not negotiate, will not make full and frank disclosure, for instance. And quite often that happens, where one party will say, one party is happy to disclose all of their finances to the other, and the other party says, no, I'm not doing that. Right? Well, they're just being pig-headed, really, because at some point they're going to have to disclose all of their assets and liabilities to the other party or to the courts in order to finalise any sort of property settlement, because a magistrate can't make a decision about how your property should be divided unless they know what that property is, and the lawyers can't, if it's in relation to a binding financial agreement, the lawyers can't provide informed advice unless they know what's in the property pool.
Yeah,
So,
it's a sad fact, and again, if there are children involved, it can get incredibly messy. So I guess
yeah,
the notion that when they're downloading a kit from your website, it seems, or it feels like, my impression, that there's already been a lot of work done and a lot of conciliation done between that time and when they come to you, I guess,
yeah,
to get these standard sets of forms.
yeah, that's pretty much it. If the parties are still fighting with each other, then over the big stuff, the little stuff, it doesn't matter. But if they're still fighting with each other and they can't come to agreement, unfortunately, I can't help. Unfortunately, the reality is, if they're still fighting with each other, there may not be any other choice but to hire a sellsword and go through the court system
And to go to war. To go to
right,
war.
and go to war, and it costs tens of thousands of dollars. I think one of the figures I heard not so long ago was, on average, it costs about $50,000 per party to go through contested litigation
Well,
per party, and it's not unusual.
yeah. So
It's not
that's a
unusual for it
salient.
to run.
That's a salient note to finish up on today. We're just about out of time. Ladies and
Sure.
gentlemen, you've been on Dollars and Making Sense. Ian McLead from RP Emery Legal Kits. Look, it's a real pleasure. We're going to have back on the show to talk about prenups. So we're going to talk about what happens before all of the wars start. And Ian McLead, thank you so kindly for your time today on Dollars and Making Sense.
Thank you, Ray. It's been an absolute pleasure.